Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Okay, how are you?
I'm doing okay.
How are your kids?
They're all right.
Good.
Uh, one of them is trying to figure out what she tried to put up posters at school. She was being provocative. I thought she was going to chalk the school with Black Lives Matter this morning, but instead she put up. Apparently, we didn't have chalk, so she put up posters that got taken down. Um,
Black Lives Matter
no,
posters?
they were ones about Dante. Like they were had a lot of text. They were very text heavy on Dante.
Oh, can
We're
you
doing-
believe it? Can you believe it? But
I
good
mean,
for your kids. I'm so proud of them. So who took them down?
um, one of the principals because she said that they shouldn't have been in the kindergarten hallway and also they don't allow anyone to put up posters at school. They're in private school. So
Mm-hmm.
now they're going to talk, but she doesn't think they're going to actually talk. So,
How old is she?
13.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Aren't you proud of her?
I know last night she told me she was going to chalk the school. And I told her I didn't hear her. She
Did you
said,
hear that? Was it on NPR today? What did I hear? Who was it? Oh no, it wasn't NPR. So we have all these black mayors here now, black women mayors. I mean, the new mayor of St. Louis is a
uh-huh.
black woman. And when they were talking about big cities with black women mayors, they didn't name St. Louis because we're so little now. But
Wow.
another one of these little municipalities, Maplewood, has a black woman mayor. And it is, I mean, it's crazy that they have a black woman mayor there because
Uh-huh.
it's so Maplewood. It's just, but she said the thing that you have to tell your daughter, the thing that got her to run for mayor was she saw a chalk message on a wall near her home, and it was for George Floyd. And it
Wow.
said Black Lives Matter in chalk. Black Lives Matter. And then it went on to list Breonna Taylor and
Uh-huh.
Arbery, and it listed all these names. And she said it really, the way that it was done, and it was done in chalk, really touched her. But the thing that made her run for mayor was we have these neighborhood
Uh-huh.
connect things,
Yeah.
and someone in the neighborhood took a picture of it and posted it and said, if you want to report this graffiti to the police, you can use my picture. She said, graffiti? That's not graffiti.
Wow.
And chalk, for God's sakes. So that incident is what I just heard it today on the radio.
Wow.
That incident is what and she's a judge, she's a black judge. It made her decide to run for mayor of her town. She's the first woman and the first black person to be the mayor of that town. She won.
Wow.
And that was, you have to tell Leora,
Uh-huh.
you have to
Yeah.
tell her. That's what did it. That's what made this woman, this chalk thing
I
is
will
what
tell
made that woman run for mayor. And she's the first black woman mayor of Maplewood.
Wow. That's incredible.
I heard that today. It's so funny that.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway.
I like that.
Anyway, yeah, it's just good to see you. How's the change? Did you start your new job?
I did. It's been interesting. Feel like it was interesting. I finished the tour on the 26th, which was Erev Pesach, but I didn't really totally feel it
Yeah.
until the following weekend because one, I went in to clean out my desk, which I hadn't had a chance to do. And then there was actually something I had kept open my Trua email for an extra week just because I had to finish up a few things. I hadn't finished one thing that I needed to get Jill. And signing out of my email for the last time was big. That felt very I did like a couple rituals. Like I did Havdalah like after first night, second night Pesach. I did to just mark the transition. And then it wasn't until after Pesach that like we went out. Like I was like, I just want the weather was nice. I was like, I just want to eat in a restaurant and go out and celebrate. So like it's been different. I know the people there really well. So like I feel like I'm building on relationships I have, but in new ways. And I'm the first person in my role. So I've just been, it's funny because you came to my class, you talked about relationships. I'm meeting with everybody. So I met with the whole staff, like individually, just to get to know them because I have different relationships with all of them.
Yeah.
pre-existing. And now I'm meeting with him again to have the more like, how can I support you? Like, what do we need? All that stuff. So it's just been a lot of, so it's very draining in good ways. It's just a lot to meet with people 5 or 6 hours a day, as you know. So, but it's good. There's a lot. I have my work cut out for me, but I'm excited.
Oh, I think it's wonderful. I really am so excited for you.
Thank you.
It's crazy. Good. Do you know my husband, Jim?
Oh, hi, I'm Rachel.
This is my friend Rachel.
Nice to meet you.
That's Jimmy. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, I'm excited for you. I think it's really.
Thank you.
You talked about making this change in Guatemala. I remember.
I know. The Guatemala trip, I did a lot of thinking and clarified for me that I don't know that I knew I was going to end up here, but it clarified for me that I should go after the type of work that I cared most about, and that needed to be my next step. And so the fact it's not entirely, well, I think what's funny is that, Teddy, one of the staff members who I've gone to work with, he's a minister, he's the senior program officer at Human Rights. He's the person I've known there the longest. We've worked together for a decade.
Yeah, with the
he also
beard.
Yeah.
I looked on the website, right?
Yeah, he's like, he's one of my favorite human beings on the planet. We once did a program at a bar where I'm like, we just need a priest, right? Because a priest, a minister, a rabbi are in a bar. But 10 years ago, I would have told you that my next job was his job. So it's funny because it's not, I'm not doing program there, but it's like, it feels like a funny sort of intuition that I had.
Wow.
Yeah.
Some interesting people coming. Hello, Stephanie. Hi, Rhodey. Hi, Paul. Hey, Marilyn. Marilyn, I know we need a date. Hey, Stephanie, we need a date too. All these people that I need to make dates with, to catch up with. Yeah. Give a few minutes and.
Sure.
I actually haven't been to one of these university series in a while. Paul, how many people usually come? I guess it depends.
Depending, maybe anywhere on the average of 13 to 18.
Okay.
Great.
It's being recorded though as well. So what we find is a lot of people will listen to the recording when they get it, when their kids go to bed or when they're done. So, but we've been doing a Tuesday night kind of adult ed series for like what, a zillion years. We just always have Tuesday night. And every month it's kind of there's a different topic. So actually next week it's Zach Fredman. You know Zach?
A little bit. I mean, I know. Yeah, we're friends. Yeah, we've met a few times. He's great.
And then the week after that is Capers Fournier. So this every week a different. We each got to pick our a favorite person to invite.
Oh, nice! Thank you.
You're mine.
I'm honored. I'm in good company.
You're mine.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're gonna give it a few minutes.
Sure.
Because we're not even at 7 yet. I had a funeral today for a woman who was 100 years old. She was from Reno, Italy. She used to walk to school with Primo Levi.
Wow.
And she survived. She survived the war by sneaking, letting smugglers, which kind of, thinking about Guatemala and all the people but trusting smugglers to take her family to Switzerland.
Wow.
And, when the family was talking, and actually I listened, she did one of those, oral history projects. And when I listened to her talk about how they were so afraid the smugglers were going to turn them in, and I was listening today about, the people in Guatemala having to trust the smugglers, it's like it doesn't end, right? Marilyn knows she goes to El Salvador every year. Knows the story.
The community has to find people that they can trust and not just send their kids with anybody.
Right.
Yeah. But it's a business.
It's a business, yeah.
That's really. I was in
complicated.
Marilyn, I was in El Salvador years ago. It was the beginning of my Jewish justice journey. I went when I was a first-year rabbinical student in 2004 with American World Service. It was the first time they had said rabbinical students on a service learning program.
So where were you? Where'd you go?
We were in Ciudad Romero for a week. And it was interesting because back in 2004, I think I went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. People were still kind of like, why are you going to El Salvador? Like they didn't understand the kind of like global connectivity that I think is a little more common today.
Yeah. They were still in the Arena government. St. Louis has a commitment to a community that repopulated from Mesa Grande in '87.
Wow.
So we have stayed with that community since '87.
That's pretty remarkable.
Well, they give us more than we'll ever give them, I'll tell you that.
Mm-hmm. One sec, my dog, he's allowed to come in once. Here.
Well, it's 7:00, so I think we're going to start.
Okay.
And, I'll just keep letting people in as they come.
Mhm.
But I have the distinct pleasure to introduce my friend, Rachel Kahn-Troster, Rabbi. She was ordained in 2008 from JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she was a student activist and a leader. Many people across the country and actually internationally as well, Israel, know her as a noted speaker and writer on anything Jewish and human rights. Oops, let me let Lisa in. Aha, there we go. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Stan. Just introducing my friend, Rachel. Rachel serves on the boards of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. I assume you're still on that board, and Chazon.
That's an old bio. I was going to say, I haven't
Really?
served on those boards in a while.
Oh my, well, you did serve on them.
I did.
And
I
a lot
learned
of those
lot
things. So let me make sure well, see, here's something that doesn't change. Are you still a dual citizen?
I am a dual citizen.
Aha, born to Canadian parents in New York because your mother delivered you early. You would have been born in Canada, which,
You have a good memory. That is true.
I kind of remember that. But, I also was privileged to know your late father, Rabbi Lawrence Troster, who was one of the founders of the Jewish environmental movement, and really a great rabbi. And I'm so grateful, not only that I got to meet him, Rachel, but that I heard him kvel about you. That was a real joy. Some more people. Here's Renee. Rachel does social justice for a living. Deep, complicated campaigns that require a grasp of political and legal issues beyond the headlines and shouting points. Her work at Trua for 14 years put the Jewish community front and center as partners in fighting against torture, dealing with questions of constitutional rights, and the intricacies of how Florida tomato workers are paid and given justice. Because these were not things that she learned in rabbinical school, Rachel needed to learn things on her own. She needed to deepen in her learning and organizing on her own. And I have seen her work firsthand. We protested Publix in Florida together. We visited midwives in the hills of Guatemala together. And am I remembering right? Weren't we arrested together on the streets of New York fighting the Muslim ban?
I think you were arrested and I was doing jail support.
You did jail support. So we were in the same fight.
Yes.
Right. That time is kind of a blur for me.
I know.
Remember the night in jail. Rachel just joined the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility as their executive vice president. This is huge. And it's huge for the Jewish community to have a rabbi in that position. From what I can understand from the website, and I hope we're going to hear a lot more about this, it's how invested capital can bring about social change, both by funding solutions and opportunities, which is called impact investing, and discouraging practices and policies through the withdrawal or withholding of investments. I guess that's kind of like boycotts, right?
Yes. Well,
Economic boycotts.
we engage with companies. We
Right.
think those are all tactics.
Right. Right. So I am thrilled that Rachel is here to share reflections on her impressive journey and tell us where she is now. And also, I hope there's an opportunity for her to challenge us to figure out ways that we can support her in her work. I also have to note that not only are we going into the, I guess, the 17th day, today's the 16th day of the counting of the Omer, but tonight is also Yom HaZikaron. And I know that Trua also, we were also co-sponsors of an international commemoration of Yom HaZikaron today with Combatants for Peace. And it was, I caught just moments of it. It's recorded, so I know we can hear more of it, but how do we, with our principles and our values, how do we honor the price of freedom, with Yom HaZikaron? And I think today doing it with Combatants for Peace, Israelis and Palestinians together, memorializing all of those who have been lost as human beings, is a step in the right direction. So, and I can't think of any other way that I would want to spend Yom HaZikaron this night, making sure people didn't die in vain, than hearing from my friend, Rabbi Rachel Kahn-Troster. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I think I visited CRC twice. Once in 2014 when we protested together, when I came out for the Ferguson Weekend of Action after the death of Michael Brown. So it feels, given what's happening in our country today and the death of Dante Williams, it feels important to be with you all tonight. And then again, I think we did a training for Trua did a training for rabbis in St. Louis that we held at CRC in, I feel like maybe it was 2016. It feels like it was before Trump. There's like I feel like there was an era organizing before Trump, and then there was Trump, and then we all kept getting arrested. So it's been an interesting journey for me to be a rabbi and do justice work. I think, growing up in the conservative movements, the idea that you would do justice work as part of your Jewish community was not a given. I also would say that it's funny, Canada itself is really liberal, but the Jewish community is more conservative, small c, and also doesn't have the same tradition of justice work that I think we see in American congregations. So I didn't know that this was something you did as part of your Jewish commitment till first we moved to the US in 1993, and the synagogue where my dad worked. I know he was an activist, right? Like as Susan mentioned, he founded, kind of was one of the founders of Jewish environmentalism. It was really important to him to think about like the care for this world. He was a theologian. I'm not a theologian. He would always say to me, like, what's your theology of the work that you do? And I was like, I don't need a theology. I just need to do the work. But we would talk about that. But I think given that the religious environmental movement was very like creation care and thinking a lot about God, and he was thinking a lot about God. So I knew he did environmentalism, but as something synagogues did or something Jews did was not part of my history. But the synagogue he came to in 1993 in South Orange, New Jersey, had a kosher food pantry, which I had it blew my mind that a synagogue would do that kind of work and made a commitment. And it really stuck with me. And then when I was studying to be a rabbi, I like to joke that it's when the conservative movement discovered social justice. This was, say, 2003 to 2008. It was during I would say the birth of the wave of the current social justice institutions that we see. So it's interesting. I sometimes teach undergraduates, and I've taught the same class for the past 11 years. Like I teach one session, and there has definitely been a shift among these young people that those who grew up in conservative synagogues are more likely to say that they grew up with justice work. But in 20 years ago, you were only really likely to say that if you grew up in a reformer Reconstructionist synagogue. But when I was in rabbinical school, people were really trying to say like this is like everyone was trying to talk to us about how to do justice work. There was like this flowering of justice as an expression. A lot of the organizations that now make up kind of like the Jewish justice world were growing. But I don't think it was a given that I was going to be a justice rabbi. It's funny. Once I started doing it, it became clear that that's what I should have done. But I didn't know that. I knew I wanted to work with adults. I'm married to a pediatrician. He's really good with kids. And when you see someone who's really good with kids, you could understand why you might not be. Like, I'm good with my kids. But I'm not, I really admire rabbis who are good with children because it's not my skill set. And then my 4th year of rabbinical school, I interned at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which is New York's gay and lesbian synagogue. And that was, I'd say, the closest I've ever come to deciding I was going to be a congregational rabbi, was working there. And Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who I don't know if has she spoken for you at all?
She hasn't, but that's where our kids go. Our confirmation class for the past many years has been going there, and they love it. They love going there.
She's great. And I would say I learned from her 2 things. One, she gave much more political sermons than I was used to. Like, the first weekend I was there, I remember she gave a sermon. She was on the founding board of Trua, which was called Rabbis for Human Rights North America at the time. At the time, they were running a campaign on US-sponsored torture. This was 2006. And I remember she gave a sermon about American use of torture, the war on terror, and the film The Battle of Algiers, right? And talked about like how corrupting torture was and winning the battle but losing the war. And it stuck with me. It didn't just stick with me because like by the end of the year I was working for Trua, but I had never really heard someone give sermons like that and to talk about, not just to talk about the moral issues of our day, but with the kind of urgency that she did. She also got arrested twice while I was her intern, and that blew my mind, right? Because I was not used to rabbis getting arrested. And she did so once, I think, protest. I forget why one of them, the other one, she was protesting the don't ask, don't tell policy. And she and someone from Human Rights Campaign shut down 7th Avenue. And I was really admired like the way that she did that. I had never seen someone protest at a talit before, but she did like all the things that I've come to do as a rabbi. I could see some of the roots in her work. And towards the end of the year, I was approaching my senior year of rabbinical school. I had no major plans for my last year at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I had very few classes left. I was going to sit under a tree and read and just have like a luxurious year. I was not going to take a job. I was going to have a baby. That I did. She's 13. But I had this opportunity to come work at Trua and to run the anti-torture campaign as a part-time job before my last year of rabbinical school. And it seemed like a really good idea, and it was really interesting work. And when I started, it became clear I was meant to be a human rights activist. And it really got me thinking about like, what are the really tough issues of doing justice work and fighting for justice? When you work to fight US-sponsored torture, you have to be willing to think about human rights as applying to everyone, no matter what they do, right? I think as Americans, especially who are not used to the concept of human rights, we think of human rights, even if we don't say this, like I think there's some level which we believe rights are something you get, right? If you are the right kind of person or you do the right things. I think we clearly see that in blame the victim narratives around victims of police violence, right? We come up with every reason possible why they don't deserve rights, why people of color don't deserve rights. Like, well, like it's so clear. But when you fight for human rights, you have to, like you understand that like human rights are the floor. They're not the ceiling. Like they're basic. And I remember reading a teaching by Art Green that human rights are, Rabbi Art Green, are like, you have to really interrogate, like they're not just for your friend, they're also for your enemy. That's really hard. And then as Jews, thinking about what that means, that when we say everyone is created in the image of God, that's also not something we aspire to. Like that is true for everybody. And that, like, if we actually lived that way, that would fundamentally change our human interactions. And I think, so I've always thought that being an anti-torture activist really shaped who I was as an activist, because it really made me take seriously the concept of human rights. I think what can be hard, especially, and I think this is especially runs up against like the Jewish need for solutions. I've often thought that like the reason why American Jews like the two-state solution is not just because of two states, but because of solutions, right? Like we want there to be solved. And sometimes as human rights activists, you don't have a solution. You just know what shouldn't be done, right? We shouldn't be torturing people. We shouldn't be depriving people of the right to a trial. We shouldn't be depriving people of a right. Like if we say healthcare is a human right, that means that everyone gets it. Now it's up to governments to solve it. And that's challenging sometimes because as the activist, people don't want you to tell them what's wrong. They also want you to tell you like what you can do about it. And sometimes you just have to say this has to stop happening. And for me, like that, really living by the principle that every human being is created in the image of God. It was really hard work. I think one of the things I really appreciate about the work I then started doing a few years later at Truah with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, which is the work on tomatoes, was it was more, even though it was like came out of our campaign on slavery, which it's funny, like I used to at Truah did really harsh work, right? Like, we used to joke I knew everything bad about every product that you would buy. Rachel ruins everything. Like I ruined chocolate, I ruined clothing, I ruined tomatoes, like that, that you don't want to go grocery shopping with me because I just like, I will leave you paralyzed in the grocery store because I know too much.
I still can't buy iceberg lettuce or grapes without.
Because of the boycott?
Yeah, from my childhood. I mean, from a long
Yeah,
time.
of course.
Right.
My mother feels guilty when she buys non-fair trade chocolate. Like, I keep having conversations with my kids that are like, oh, look, this clothing brand is sustainable. And I'll say, sustainable has no meaning. Tell me what that means, but you mean by that, right? Is it a labor standard? And then I'll tell her that all the labor standards are BS. And like, I'm really can be difficult. But the other reason I like doing the work with Coalition of Immokalee Workers is even though it was a very hardcore campaign, it was joyous and it was something I could bring my kids to. I have pictures of my kids' first protest. It was for the rights of farm workers. I used to joke that there were only 3 types of photos on my phone. Cute pictures of my children, protest photos, and cute pictures of my kids at protests. Now there are pictures of the dog too, because the kids don't want to be in as many pictures. But really, I think that, so we started working with Coalition of Immokalee Workers in 2011. How much have you talked about?
As I'm looking around, I don't think that, we had 2 members of CRC, Amy Gage and Scott Levine, go to Immokalee.
Right.
Neither one of them are here. And I don't think people.
All right, so I'll give the background. So,
yeah, it's such a great story.
Yeah, so they changed my life. I think it's sometimes really important to know, like, sometimes you have those chance encounters that change your life. So Truah had been working on fighting forced labor, and anti-trafficking work, and we were trying to figure out how to do that from a human rights perspective. And also, I think there was some concern among some of the rabbis on our board that you can see this in a lot of issues, but it's really true in the fight on trafficking. We hear a lot that fighting trafficking is a consensus issue, right? And it was, like in Congress, the major piece of anti-trafficking legislation was a bipartisan bill in the year 2000. It was a largely bipartisan issue in Congress until 2010, because the Tea Party picked off so many Republican incumbents that a lot of the traditional champions of fighting trafficking got picked off by their own party. It's interesting. One of the remaining champions is from my own states, Chris Smith, who's like I was going to say he's the only remaining Republican in the New Jersey congressional delegation, except one congressman switched parties, so he's not. But he's like, that's it, and he's been around forever. But when you actually, so people can talk about trafficking and everyone can agree on it, but if you actually deal with the root causes of human trafficking, then it is no longer a consensus issue, because then you have to have conversations about the rights of workers and immigration and the low status of women and girls and LGBTQ people, right? Like a really great example is that one of the solutions to trafficking is shelter beds for runaway and homeless youth, and especially LGBTQ youth, right? But then when you try and pass federal funding for shelter beds for runaway and homeless youth, including LGBTQ youth, you have Republicans who want to allow service providers to opt out of servicing LGBTQ youth who are like the most at risk, right? So here it is, we have this consensus issue, but if you want to deal with solutions, suddenly people are like pulling out support for the actual solutions. Or, you know, we would need comprehensive immigration reform so that people who are coming to this country are not vulnerable to exploitation. Or we would need a lot of labor visas don't have portability, meaning like you can't move from one employer to another. So if you're in a vulnerable position and you're being, you know, trafficking doesn't, like, not every exploited worker is trafficked. If you have a system of exploitation, some percentage of workers will be trafficked, right? I remember hearing the estimates from one of the coalition's anti-trafficking experts that if you looked at Florida agricultural workers don't have a lot of rights, at like 1% to 2% at any given time were trafficked, right? So trafficking happens in a degraded labor environment. So if one of those things is that people are afraid of retaliation and they can't speak up to their employers, that creates a degraded labor environment. And people's visas don't allow them to switch jobs. If they get fired for complaining, they'll get deported. Then it's harder for them to complain. That's a root cause of trafficking. So like those types of things are much more controversial. And so you can't actually, so it wasn't a bipartisan issue, but I think there was concern at Trudeau that because it seemed more safe. Here it was, right? We've been working on Israel, Palestine, and torture. And now we took on trafficking, and people were worried that it was going to seem safe. That's funny as a human rights activist when your safe issue is fighting human trafficking. But for Trudeau, it was. It actually remains this like quote unquote safest thing we ever worked on. I used to find, because Israel Palestine is such a lightning rod, as you know, for conversation, I actually would say that I always found our work on North American human rights issues less polarizing. I would say that was true until the death of Michael Brown and we started working on police reform. And that was way more polarizing. And then obviously in the Trump era, things got more polarizing. And I don't know how you guys have seen this, but like I have definitely seen over time, you know, having been in human rights work 14 years, which both feels like nothing and a long time, issues that used to be consensus issues aren't, right? Like fighting hunger, you know, things that get clergy. I worked primarily with rabbis and cantors at Trudeau. Things that didn't used to get people into trouble started to get people into trouble. That really scares me. You know, even the things that like you could, like the quote unquote safe social justice issues that you could talk about and bring people together were less so. So we were fighting trafficking, and one of our co-chairs, Rabbi Chuck Feinberg, went to a conference. And usually conferences are not great spaces to meet people. You know, you go to a conference, kind of boring. He sat down at a table and someone said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, my name's Rabbi Chuck Feinberg. I organize rabbis to fight trafficking." And then I said, "Oh, that's interesting. We organize farm workers in Florida. We work really well with faith communities. We don't have any Jews. Would you guys like to come meet with us?" So I still have the first email. You ever like say, even today, like I know it's email is not letters, but I have a few pieces of email that I know changed my life, right? So this is the email that changed my life. I got an email from a reverend who had been working with the farm workers for close to a decade. And she was explaining who they were and why we were important. And she's like, "We really would love for you to get involved." What was the Coalition of Immokalee Workers doing? They were doing some really interesting work. They basically had represented farm workers in Florida, people who had come in the early 1990s from Haiti and Guatemala and Mexico primarily. The wages hadn't really budged since the 1970s, and they were still getting paid by how much they picked. And they had been organizing against the growers. And because also like in most states, farm workers in Florida can't unionize. So that's why that wasn't taken as a tactic. And they realized that even the growers and the working conditions of the farms were really bad. Like Florida agriculture was called ground zero for human trafficking in America. Like it just, we had, there was sexual assault in the fields. There were supervisors who were threatening people with guns, like workplaces.
We saw containers when we were there where people were actually, the workers were chained into the containers, right? They were chained there so they couldn't leave at night.
Right. That was it.
Right.
Yeah, that was the Navarrete slave case. Again, because like some percent, you had this really exploitative work environment, and some percentage of the workers were exploited, were trafficked. And so they knew that the growers could change conditions, but they also knew the growers were getting squeezed. And because of the consolidation of the grocery industry, there were fewer and fewer places they could sell their tomatoes. It's odd. Like, why do we even grow tomatoes in Florida? We think of maybe citrus coming from Florida. The only reason why we grow tomatoes in Florida is because it's hot in the winter. For those of us like me who live east of the Mississippi, a lot of our domestic produce in the winter comes from Florida. And it's only because it's hot in the winter. There's no soil in Florida. I don't remember, Susan, if you remember this, they truck in soil, they put it in the fields on top of the sand, they cover it with tarp, and then they poke holes and they planted it. So the workers, I think one reason that I like corporate accountability work, like what they did, is they thought to themselves, well, like there are solutions that come from government, and then there are solutions that come from looking at our economic forces. And I think because corporations often fall outside of our human rights treaties, because they lobby Congress, they have less oversight. We have to create binding standards for them, because often they'll be like, hey, we have this code of conduct and it's really nice. And we have someone who visits the fields once a year and talks to 3 workers and everything's fine. It doesn't really work that. And they get a nice seal and they'll put it on the product. It doesn't work that way. So the workers, and I also think that there's a lot of like work about like the products that we buy, that one does not prioritize the experiences of the people actually like picking the products, or like they're experts. I remember one person referred to our work in Florida as like, oh, your project in Florida. Is like, I'm a rabbi in New York. I don't know anything about Florida agriculture. But I think there's a lot of bias against people without traditional education to actually like create solutions. And the other is that I found this was really hard for me as an activist, that as an anti-trafficking activist, when we talked about how to support victims of sex trafficking, we talked about people. And often when we talked about what to do about labor trafficking, we talked about buying a better product, and we didn't center people. And as Jews, like, it's the tomato worker who's created in the image of God, right? It's not the tomato. And so we had to like finding a solution as a rabbinic human rights organization that centered people, and not just, I mean, obviously we tell people to buy good products, but that itself is not a mitzvah. So the farm workers had basically said, we really have to hold the corporations at the top of the supply chain responsible for the human rights abuses at the bottom. That in the year 2000 was a new concept, and is still a contested concept, that corporations have responsibility for the conditions, not just for their direct workers, but all the way down their supply chain. They really don't want this. They don't want to be responsible. You see this after there's like, in 2 weeks, we have the not 2 weeks, week and a half is the anniversary of the Rana Plaza disaster, where a factory in Bangladesh collapsed, killing 1,000 workers. And how did all the brands respond? They just moved their product elsewhere. They didn't say, well, maybe because we insisted that corporations I have a friend who's an activist who's called International Garment like a giant criminal enterprise. Like they have, the supplier, the companies don't acknowledge that they pay so little that they're going to be corners cut on like safety and wages. And they do that deliberately. And then they say, well, we'll just move our supply chain when something is wrong. Corporations have to be held responsible, and they have to be held responsible in legally binding ways. We can't just depend on them to do the right thing. We have to actually have teeth and market consequences. So the coalition partnered, known as the CIW, Coalition of Immokalee Workers, they partnered with 3 groups of low-hanging fruit, basically. People of faith, college activists, and consumers of conscience, to organize together with farm workers in the lead, to get the major buyers of Florida tomatoes, so restaurants and supermarkets and food service companies, to agree to 2 things.
Wendy's.
Wendy's has not done it. We have a fascinating shareholder resolution up at Wendy's this year. Basically to have them agree to 2 things. One, that they would pay a premium, the penny per pound, for Florida tomatoes that would go all the way through the supply chain, so straight to farm workers. So at the time, the farm workers picked these 32-pound buckets.
You gotta say that slower. It was just a penny a pound.
Yeah, a penny per pound.
1 penny a pound was going to change everything for the farm workers, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So right now, farm workers pick buckets of tomatoes that are 32 pounds each, and they were getting paid about 50 cents a bucket, and that wage hadn't really changed since the 1970s. And so the companies were going to So then you would make 82 cents a bucket, and that was going to help alleviate poverty. And the other thing was that they were going to agree to buy only from growers who had instituted an extremely strict third-party monitored code of conduct on their farms that covered everything: the right to shade in the fields, the right to water in the fields, the right to a time clock in the fields. And those types of things would guarantee all of the like simple dignities that a lot of us take for granted. I think another piece that I've learned as a human rights activist is that like the ability to be seen as a full person is a privilege, right? We talk about workers as though they're a faceless class of people without realizing that like if you're a farm worker and there's a time clock in the field, you're not going to sit in the field unpaid waiting for the dew to dry. So you might, instead of leaving for work at 3, you might leave for work at 7, and then you can take your kid to school, right? That's human rights in action. I worked with dairy workers in Vermont, and their code of conduct says like, apparently the dairy farmers used to keep medicines for the cows in the bathrooms, right? So like they needed the right to go to the bathroom in peace. That's the type of thing that unless you have workers in design of their human rights codes, you'd never know. So the farm workers organized, and they by now have gotten 14 major corporations to agree to these codes of conduct. But by 2009, 2010, they'd gotten, I think, 9 of them, but the growers hadn't agreed to implement it. They were fighting tooth and nail against the farm workers. They really didn't see them as full people at the time. One of them even said, the tractor doesn't tell the farmer how to farm, which is like how they viewed their workers as just like equipment. And then there was a Jewish grower named John S. Forms, who was kind of tired of seeing his family name dragged through the mud, who said, let's do something different. Why don't I meet with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers? Why don't I see what they want? And he met with them, and he realized that that a lot of what his company was doing was what they were asking for, that they could do better, and that, that he could make a difference in his industry. And so he agreed. He became the first grower to agree to implement this code of conduct on his farm. Him doing so caused his whole industry. It started a chain reaction. Eventually, all the Florida growers agreed. And when he signed with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, it was a big deal. He flew his rabbi out from Los Angeles. They signed it under a tree. And I had to say, when I quote Heschel, it's a little bit of a cliche, but when someone who like changes the world like that quotes Heschel and says few are guilty, but all are responsible, it means like a lot. So he did that, and that started changing the growing conditions. Like, so that the Florida tomato industry went from ground zero from human trafficking, thanks to the pressure we put on the growers, thanks to the pressure we put on these companies to join, to one of the best workplaces in agriculture. I didn't know any of this in 2011 when we first went. When Truah first went in 2011, we took our first group of what we called tomato rabbis. Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who's our executive director, tweeted, she's like, follow us on Twitter at #tomato-rabbis. And it just kind of stuck. We went in September of 2011. And the Fair Food Program was just about to be implemented for the first time, this code of conduct on Florida farms. So the change for workers in the fields was just about to happen. So over the past decade, we got to see the change for workers happen in real time, which for me was really inspiring, to not just take people to Florida, have them learn for the tomato workers, have them go to a protest either at a Publix supermarket or at a Wendy's. Rabbis, I don't know if you've noticed, tend to like to give sermon. Well, not your rabbis, but many rabbis like to teach and they like to give sermons. But if you actually tell them to protest, it was harder. Again, not your rabbis. So we used to make the rabbis do a protest in a grocery store or at a Wendy's while they were on the trip with us, so that they would go home and teach their communities to do that. We actually got to see things change for farm workers through bringing Truah rabbis there. And it changed my life too, because I think, one, they were just so inspiring. It was nice to be part of a protest. Like, as an activist, you lose a lot or you struggle a lot. And moments of winning and also moments of joy are far apart. I can probably tell you, after 14 years in human rights work, when all the times I won were, and there aren't a lot of them. But to be part of a movement that feels like it's inspiring people to change, and so many people were part of, was really good. And to actually, I think it was from, people understand better now what it means to be led by the people most affected by an issue. Like we worked on solitary confinement, and I've seen the movement to end mass incarceration be increasingly led by the formerly incarcerated, so that way, like, not just in a, like, on a real substantive level, right? Like hiring staff who are, putting people on boards, like not just putting people who are most affected to talk in front to talk about their pain, but to actually hear their leadership. But that's not a given. It's something we have to fight for. And so to have the coalition of Immokalee workers say to Trua, like, you are not the experts in solving our human rights issues. We are the experts. Your job is to organize the Jewish community. It was like a very nice stay in your lane, which I was not used to being told in 2012. We had just won a campaign. This is actually a really great story. So when we first started organizing with the tomato rabbis, the campaign target was Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's had not signed the Fair Food Program. And we're like, great, those are our people shop at Trader Joe's. We can protest Trader Joe's. So like for Sukkot, there were a couple places that did like a pop-up sukkah outside of Trader Joe's, and like, handed out, like they were handing out a penny per pound in the little cup and be like, do you want to sample justice? There was a giant protest outside of in California, outside of the corporate headquarters, that I still regret not going to, where we hung a letter on the door of the Trader Joe's headquarters, signed by like over 100 rabbis, calling on them to join the Fair Food Program. And the security guard tore it down, leading to the headline, Trader Joe's closes doors to rabbis and ministers, which is never a headline you want ever. Anyway, so I had taken the second group we had taken this first group of tomato rabbis to Florida, fall of 2011, getting people really involved in the campaign, fighting Trader Joe's. I took a second group of tomato rabbis down because the first Trader Joe's was opening in Florida. Like, that seems crazy now that it was the first one, but in 2012, it was the first Trader Joe's. It was opening on Immokalee Road. So we did a little like dedications. I took the tomato rabbis there. We did a little dedication ceremony. We sounded a shofar. We hung a mezuzah, which was like a CIW postcard with a penny for the penny per pound. We put it on the door of the store. We blessed the store. We said, may this store open for justice. And it's February. I've just flown home, so I've flown home from Florida, and it's about to be Valentine's Day weekend, and there are protests planned around the whole country at Trader Joe's across the country. And I said to my kids, I was like, do you want to go to the Valentine's Day party? Actually, just one kid, because my other one at the time was 1 and would not have known what to do. 2. And I said to my older daughter, I was like, Valentine's Day party, protest with mommy. And she's like, protest with mommy and Valentine's Day party. But anyways, so we were going to go to a protest in Union Square, New York. So I get home from Florida, and I'm driving around New Jersey, and my phone starts buzzing at me. And I get this text that says, we won. I was like, what? And it's like, and we won. And Trader Joe's had signed the Fair Food Program. I had just been in Immokalee. I hadn't heard a thing, but it was really great to be like, and they're like, it must have been the rabbis doing the protest. And it was really great to feel like we were part of change. But at that point, I had a lot of ideas about like what the next campaign was. And they were like, no, you should stay in your lane, organize the Jewish community, be good at what you're good at. And I think movements are smarter about that now, right? Like a decade later, I think especially movements that organize people of privilege or organize largely in predominantly white communities are getting better, I hope, about being led by the people most affected and knowing ourselves. But that was newer back then. I remember being in a room of Jewish organizations trying to organize immigration where it was completely siloed. This was, again, a decade ago, from immigrant-led organizations. And under the Trump administration, Jewish organizing on immigration did not do that. They organized with immigrant-led groups. But for us to be told to learn to organize ourselves was really important for us at the time. And I think it really taught us to be led by the people who were most affected. And that taught me that maybe the human rights work I was meant to do also, this took a while for me to realize this, was the work on corporate accountability, which I would say the Jewish community does not do a lot of. We do it on a really basic level. We stand in support of striking workers, but using our financial leverage to hold corporations accountable is not a strategy of most Jewish justice organizations. There's a lot of Jews doing the work, right? Like I run into Jews doing the work all the time, but Jewish organizations, it's not. I think most Jewish social justice organizations have a lot of success doing political accountability. But I think especially right now, given but it creates some real gaps. Like there have not been like Jewish groups really taking the lead on the organizing on Amazon, right? Or issuing statements of support on that. It means that, I mean, there are obviously always gaps in organizing, but I think I was seeing that this was an important place for Trua and the Jewish community to get involved. So, and I was really interested in the ways in which, it's funny. I think I'm underneath it all, I'm a radical. Like there's an internal strategy document I helped write that starts off by saying like, there's no such thing as responsible investing under capitalism, but investors have unique power. So like, I think I'm a bit of a radical for the organization I just joined, but that's okay. I think we have to, again, it's not just we have to be led by the people most affected. We have to understand who is the force for good in the world. So I think investment and holding corporations accountable is a tool we can use. I don't necessarily think that corporations are a force for good in the world, if that makes sense. But the Jewish community hasn't really been involved. My organization that I just joined, I know I've been talking a lot, so I don't know if you want me to stop and take questions or I can keep talking. Wait, Susan, I can't hear you.
I think the story of Immokalee is so important, and the fact that we're still there, there's still work to do, that the grower was a Jewish guy. I think you took us to meet with him.
You did.
We were there, and I still remember one of the things he said. He said, well, we give them turkeys on Thanksgiving and we give them presents for Christmas. And I remember one of the workers, the leaders, saying, pay us enough to buy our own turkeys and our own gifts for Christmas. Thank you very much.
Yes.
And, I think that it might have been a setup for us to experience that, but we also did get to see the grueling work. We also did get to see what a difference a penny a pound meant in the field.
Right.
And it was life-changing for me too, to become a tomato rabbi and to see to see what grassroots organizing, what real allyship looked like when Jews were organized, not top down, not separate, but really to be part of a movement. And that's what I love about Immokalee. And so now the transition to your new job, I think, is also really tremendous and has a lot of potential. It certainly has a lot of relevance for what's happening in Georgia.
Oh my God.
I'm sure you guys are so involved in what's going on in Georgia. So, now if you'll tell us, about your new organization and what it means to have a rabbi there. You have to be their first rabbi.
I am, it's interesting. So my new organization is called the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, or ICCR. We were founded in the 70s. So this is actually our 50th anniversary year, to fight apartheid in South Africa. And we were founded
boycotts, right?
Boycotts, divestment. There was a long time when especially in environmentalism, when ICCR was very anti-divestment, because obviously if your strategy is to engage with companies, divestment is not a useful tool. But now we understand it as part of a bigger ecosystem of change. Boycott, I think there goes the dog. And the reform movement was actually they're not a very active member, but they're one of our largest members. And they were I believe they were one of our founders. I think it was like a bunch of Protestant denominations, the pension funds of a bunch of priests and nuns, and the reform movement for, the UAHC. And it's interesting because there aren't a ton of Jews in the room. And because I think the Jewish community has not had its money organized in the ways that Christian denominations are. Like we don't have, other than the Reform movement, we don't have pension funds. A lot of our money is in family foundations or in federations. And so we tend to think of, when we think of using money to make a difference in the world, we think about how we give tzedakah, and we haven't thought a lot about where we invest the money. Even foundations, they don't think about where their money is invested, and they don't, if they do, they're thinking about like return on investment, and they're not thinking about like, how can we maybe, like if we're a big Jewish foundation and we're supporting a social justice cause like Coalition of Immokalee Workers, could we use our assets to be in support of their work? Like, right, like I own, our current target is Wendy's. I own one share of Wendy's. I was teaching a group and they said, what can we do? A group of impact investors, and they felt small because they didn't have a lot of money. And I told them what I've done with one share of Wendy's, right? I have gone and protested at an annual general meeting in Columbus, Ohio. I have turned my share over to a farm worker so that they could protest at a meeting. I've turned it over to a rabbi from Kansas City who went to the meeting and spoke to the major shareholder who's Jewish and said, rabbis want you to sign the Fair Food Program. And he said, I have enough rabbis in my life. And so we went and did a protest in his office because he did not have enough rabbis in his life. I have used my share to attend last year's virtual general meeting when they wouldn't let anyone who wasn't a shareholder in, and I asked the question on behalf of the coalition. So we think we need lots of money to make a difference, but we really don't, right? We can, especially if we do it as a tactic. And I really want to see the Jewish community doing more of that. I think part of why I think this is an interesting time for them to have a rabbi is because I think as the Jewish community, we understand the changing nature of faith in the United States and the changing nature of affiliation. You know, it's interesting when they talk about faith and values-based investors, and I feel like those are almost like I know so many people who act out of Jewish values but not out of Jewish faith, right? Like there's a huge group of Jews whose affiliation of Jews of no religion, right? And sometimes understanding that in a more Christian space where you're used to faith meaning very specific things and forms of affiliation is also, I think, really interesting to them. When I believe I've used the words Christian hegemony a little bit more than I expected. But like actually thinking about like how people use their values to express them through their work. There's a lot of talk right now about socially responsible investment, but I think one of the things that makes my coalition different is that we are really connected with grassroots groups. Coalitions like United for Respect, which is organizing at Walmart, talking about like rights holders, right? Like there's a huge business and human rights space, which is very white and very European. But we talk about like making sure that like not just rights holders are heard, right? That's big, right? People be like, oh, we're a business and we're going to listen to rights holders, but you actually have to give people like leadership and voice. And I think that's something I'm hoping to have learned, like having learned in the fields of Florida, what it means to be led by the people most affected. I'm trying to bring that to my, Rudy, you have your hand up and I keep missing you. But now you're muted.
Did you ever travel to Israel and work on a kibbutz?
I have not worked at a kibbutz in Israel. I was last in Israel in 2019, so 6 months before the pandemic. It was a really interesting chance for me. It's interesting, as I think I mentioned early on, Trua worked on both Israel-Palestine issues and also on North American social justice issues. As is pretty clear, my focus there was on our North American work, but I really wanted to go see the work we did with human rights activists in Israel. So I was lucky enough to get to do that right before the pandemic, and to actually meet with Breaking the Silence and other Israeli human rights organizations was really transformative for me. And I hadn't been in Israel in a long time. And so, to see the changing nature of the occupation was really hard. But it was great to actually meet the people who are fighting it. And try and make sure that we in North America had a chance to amplify their work.
Well, where'd you go in Israel?
Jerusalem and Tel Aviv mostly.
Oh, that's fun. What made you want to become a rabbi?
What made me want to become a rabbi? That's a great question. So I think, as Susan mentioned, I am a rabbi's kid.
Oh,
Um, so the Reform movement started ordaining women as rabbis in the 1960s, but the conservative movement didn't start ordaining women as rabbis until the mid 1980s. And that meant that when my dad was studying to be a rabbi, women were not part of the rabbinical school. And he and my mom, who's not a rabbi, started a group called GROW, which is the Group for the Rabbinic Ordination of Women. And they tried to organize the faculty at the Jewish Theological Seminary to be in favor of the ordination of women. And they tried to organize in the Rabbinical Assembly. And they held a protest outside of JTS, which had never been done before. And at the time, the chancellor of the seminary was not publicly in favor of the ordination of women, but he had changed his mind. And my parents, I'm a twin. I have an identical twin sister. She lives in Maine. She's not a rabbi. She's married to a rabbi. He's a professor. So we have a lot of rabbis in my family, but identical twin sister. So my parents took a picture of my twin and I when we were 10 months old, wearing t-shirts that said JTS, class of 2001, which is when I would have gone to rabbinical school had I not taken a couple of years off. And then put a question mark, and they sent it to the whole faculty. And when the chancellor got the letter, he wrote a recommendation letter for the two of us for rabbinical school at the age of 10 months, which I forgot to use when I applied to rabbinical school. But there's a book called Women Who Would Be Rabbis, which is largely about the Reform movement. But if you look at it, there's a picture of my twin, and that picture is in there of my twin and I. I think then she didn't become a rabbi, but I think I always wanted to. I think I saw that being a rabbi was a way to bridge like teaching with being present with people, and just a lot of interesting ways to do good. And I think what was challenging was that when I started working at Trua, I was like, well, I was pretty young. I was only, I think I finished rabbinical school when I was 29. Yeah, that makes sense. And I had started Trua when I was 28. I think because I had never really wanted to do anything else, I used to say, well, I'm pretending to be a rabbi, but I'm really a human rights activist. And I think over time, I think especially given how difficult the Trump years were, and I think we all kind of had to not just do the activism, but find spiritually like what sustained us in the work. I know that I feel a bit more like a rabbi than I did when I started. I used to identify more as a human rights activist, and now I kind of get both.
Mm. Does the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility have a stand on BDS?
We don't, because we don't work on Israel. It's not one of our core issues. One thing that's really interesting, I work with a group called Heartland, who advise investors on conflict zones. And they do a lot of work on Israel-Palestine because they also do a lot of work on other conflict zones. And I think what they've done is, I think their work is really interesting because it takes the sort of complaint that sometimes we hear about activism on Israel, like what about everything else? And it contextualizes the work on Israel in the context of a variety of conflict zones and how investors and businesses have responsibility in conflict zones. I think what's hard is that there is investor activism that happens about Israel that isn't BDS. BDS is a Palestinian solidarity movement.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a call to businesses, like businesses under what are called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are like not quite a treaty. Under them, businesses have an obligation to respect human rights. Investors have a responsibility not to be complicit in human rights violations, and they have to remedy the situation. So if the occupation is a violation of human rights, then a business who is respecting human rights under the UN Guiding Principles can't do business in the West Bank, or an investor shouldn't be investing in businesses that are in the West Bank. And therefore, you might end up divesting from Israeli businesses, right? Because most Israeli businesses do business over the Green Line. It's just so embedded in the economy. So that wouldn't be a boycott campaign against aimed at Israel, that would be divesting from Israeli companies because they're complicit in human rights abuses. The same way that like investors should divest from clothing brands that are doing business in Xinjiang province because of the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims. So I think sometimes investors get accused of boycotting Israel because people don't see the broader human rights work being done. And so there are investors within ICCR who have divested from Israel, but most of them, it's part of a broader portfolio. But Israel itself is not one of our issue areas.
Looks like Marion has a question.
Sure.
Oh, now you're muted, Marion.
I went backwards. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I hope this doesn't pull us off topic.
It's
I'm
fine.
really interested in the idea that the people who are involved should be the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in why that lesson is so hard to learn. I'm going to preface this by saying that 55 years ago, I was a group of people that in Boston who tutored in Roxbury. And it was Malcolm X himself who came and said, hey, go back to Brandeis. We'll take care of tutoring in Roxbury. You go talk to your racist uncles and relatives. And it was a monumental moment in my young life. And I've watched so long that lesson gets learned and then unlearned, and for whatever set of reasons, just doesn't stay learned.
It's a really good question. I think about it a lot. I think one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently, and this is not just true of justice work, is the tension between what you want to do and what you're needed to do, right? And sometimes what we want to do is not what we're needed to do. And I think actually hearing from people who are most affected what we're needed to do, and that may not be what we want to do, I think it's hard. I know for me and the movements that I've been part of in this particular work, I think there are a lot of people who are embedded who are paid to come up with solutions, and they don't have trust that the people who are most affected can be part of those conversations. And I think actually showing them why solutions designed by the people most affected, it means people are going to have to give up power, and they're going to have to be at the table with people who they don't think of as having, it just fundamentally changes the power dynamic. And I think if that's true for our adversaries, it's also true for our own movements. And I think that's hard, right? We like to be the ones to solve things, but sometimes we just have to take a step back.
The other place that I saw it, I lived in Africa for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And Kenya was filled with agencies of really nice people wanting to do really nice things. And it didn't get real, the scratch didn't get near where the itch was. And it's just, there's some kind of power dynamics that takes place within the organizations themselves that want to help. I can't quite grasp it.
It was interesting when we, so a number of years ago at Trua, I had a great colleague there. He's still there. His name is Rabbi Lev Meyerowitz Nelson, and he did all of our Jewish resources. And we wrote a Haggadah, an anti-trafficking Haggadah. And part of what we tried to do, this was not just important to us, like as people in movements, but also theologically, that we noticed that a lot of Haggadahs that were about social justice issues focused too much on the problem. The Haggadah moves us through time, right? We just came out of Passover. Like Haggadah tells the story of the past, and then the meal is like the moment of the present, and then it's a story of liberation. But that social justice Haggadahs forgot that journey, right? That they only talked about like the slavery piece, sometimes literally if you're writing an anti-trafficking Haggadah. So we tried to make our Haggadah mimic that, right? But also to tell the story. That meant though that when we raised up the voices of people who were survivors of trafficking, we didn't just do so to tell their story of imprisonment and pain. We also had them talk about their solutions, and we manifested that all the way through the Haggadah, so that way we were not just using their stories to make ourselves feel bad, but to actually make ourselves feel like we could move to action. And it's interesting, we included art from survivors of trafficking who we paid for their work, because we wanted to make sure that we were not just benefiting from their imagery. And we had some beautiful photos, some beautiful artwork that they had done, because we're like, this is also important. Like human rights respect is shown by paying people well, and we wanted to support them. But I think you're right. There's a lot of good meaning people. I think it's just going to be one of the challenges we are always thinking about is what is our role, and how do we take a step back sometimes.
Are there more questions I'm not sure if I saw. Yeah, I'd love to hear about what your challenges are now, and are you guys involved in what's happening in Georgia at all?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm learning. As I mentioned, I started 2 weeks ago. I'm learning a tremendous amount. So we are talking about how to get involved in Georgia, because the issue of corporate political spending, which is different than lobbying, right? Corporations lobby, but they also spend money on candidates. And a lot of investors feel like that maybe corporations shouldn't be spending money on candidates and so to actually hold them accountable for using their leverage to pressure states to say these laws are unacceptable, I think can be really important. So I know that there was just a sign-on letter today for individuals that I saw to pressure corporations, but there's a sort of how do we get investors to talk to companies about this, and sort of create a coordinated response, because of the way. So a lot of what my new organization does is using the shareholder resolution process, where a shareholder who holds a certain amount of shares and has held them for a certain length of time. We usually work with institutions. So because even though you could say it's not a lot of money to own you need $2,000 worth of shares that you've held for at least a year to file a resolution, which is actually a lot of money. I was interested. I was at a meeting at the SEC right before the pandemic. That was weird. I was like, why am I at the SEC? But I was at the SEC with talking with Clayton about it. He's like, well, it's not a lot of money. And I was thinking, yeah, for most people in this country, $2,000. He's like, they were trying to raise, the Trump administration raised the threshold for filing a shareholder resolution, which we're now suing.
Could you talk about what does that mean?
Okay, so
spell that out for us, and
so
tell us how we can do that too.
Right. So one of the things that we pressure companies about is that we file resolutions with them to ask them to change their behavior. A lot of those resolutions are simply about asking them to disclose what they're doing. It's been interesting for me in human rights work. Transparency feels like a very small thing, right? Just tell us what you're doing, right? There's one of the major pieces of anti-trafficking legislation is called the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, where businesses that do at least $100 million worth of business in California, which is everybody because it's the 8th biggest economy in the world, just had to put on their websites what their anti-trafficking policy was. Didn't even have to be a good policy. Right? It could be, we have no policy, and businesses fought it tooth and nail. So transparency seems like it's such a small thing. Just tell us what you're doing. And then corporations fight transparency tooth and nail. So a lot of shareholder resolutions are about disclosures, getting companies to just tell us what they're doing. But in order to keep people from filing resolutions to be a nuisance on the company, the federal government the Securities and Exchange Commission establishes rules by how much of the company do you have to own, and how long do you have to have owned it for in order to file a resolution, to basically ask the company to do something or to change its behavior or to disclose something. And so the rule has been for a long time that you have to own $2,000 worth of stock for at least a year. And often the corporation will challenge, and then it gets voted on at the annual meeting. Now, often the corporation will try and keep it off getting voted on because they don't like that. And they'll do so by saying it interferes, all kinds of things that they've already substantially implemented. But we're usually asking, with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, I'm usually asking companies to join the Fair Food Program, right? Wendy's join the Fair Food Program. That would be, we did that resolution a few years ago. Before there was a Fair Food Program, it was support the human rights of farm workers. But now we can't ask that, because if we ask them something vague, when we want them to do something concrete, they'll say, but we've done the vague thing. We support the human rights of farm workers. Look at these. We send them turkeys, on Thanksgiving, and they still won't have joined the Fair Food Program. So companies want
If
to
enough
limit.
people got shares in Wendy's,
I own a share. I own one share.
I know, but if everybody did that, would we be able to change it?
Okay, so one, I don't know. I think right now we're not asking. We have in past asked people to buy one share to help with access. Because also what happens at the annual general meeting is that you only need one share to be allowed to go and to speak to the company. So we've done that as a tactic. There was one year we stealth brought 40 shareholders. I'd been to the company's annual general meeting. Wendy's is based in Columbus, Ohio, which means I have spent more time in Columbus, Ohio than one might guess for someone from New Jersey. And I remember going to the shareholder meeting and I thought to myself, well, this is kind of sleepy and quiet. There's only 50 people in this room. There's like the corporate leadership from New York and some random shareholders from the Midwest who just apparently like to go to shareholder meetings. What if we brought 50 people to this meeting and took it over? Which is what we did the next year. We had 50 of us, and we were mostly allies. So we were all, and no one could tell we were with CIW. And I think we held the floor of the meeting for an hour, asking different questions to the company. So then they got smart to us and they tried to they started checking up a lot more about who was there. But, because it's a chance to actually speak to leadership and ask questions directly. And what we would often do is I would have a share and I would give it to a farm worker so that they could speak to the company, right? You can do that. You can have someone attend the annual meeting on your behalf. So because companies don't like having to answer shareholder resolutions, they've been pressuring through the government to raise how much stock you have to have owned and for how long. So the Trump administration, and by the way, if anyone here is in finance, you may correct me on this, because one big thing I've learned switching jobs is I came at this from the activist side, and now that I'm working, I'm still learning all the lingo, right? When you change jobs, you're learning all the new lingo, you're learning. So I'm not as precise on this as I think I want to be, but so they raised it so that you would need to own $15,000 of stock for a year. If you only had 2,000, you'd have to own it for 3 years. And because their theory is they don't want people buying shares of companies just to file on the company and then leave. But the thing is that a lot of the investors who I work with, because they're faith and values based investors, and they're not just interested in returns, they're interested in the impact on people and planet. They often own corporations for a long time, right? So that they can engage with them year after year and push them on their corporate behavior. Often what they'll do is when they file a resolution saying company X, we want you to do Y, the company will say, we'll talk to you if you take it off the ballot. And so that is what some shareholders will do. Others really want it to go for a vote. But it's a part of a tactic of kind of get companies to change their behavior by making them accountable to their shareholders. And I think bringing up the idea that corporations have a responsibility beyond return on investment, which I think is important. I think companies I'm not saying that companies used to be better citizens, but I think companies used to have more of a sense of place and of corporate citizenship. And maybe they wouldn't take responsibility for all their direct suppliers, their direct value chain, but they would have more of a sense of responsibility of impact. For many companies, we have to make both the business case for human rights, which is I have a harder time with that. I think you should do the right thing because you should do the right thing. And so, but I think some companies are going to be moved by the business case. You also make the moral case for human rights. And I think you also have to talk about why it's important, even when the business case isn't as strong. One of the big issues that we work on is climate. We're actually part of, and as I talked about earlier, my dad was a Jewish environmentalist. So for me to actually get to work on climate as a rabbi and is very exciting. Because although I love Trua, I was there for so long, but we didn't work on climate. So to be a part of an organization that not only does human rights work, but works on climate change, which I think is one of the big moral issues of our time, is really nice. I'm very excited about that. But on climate, the business case is really strong. If corporations, aren't talking about moving to a carbon neutral, about decarbonization, if they're really imperiling their business model. There are other human rights issues where, like, as I think I mentioned, like the business model is built on human misery, right? So you can't make the business cases easily because like the supply chain is like,
Can you
not-
say that once again? Say that once again.
there are a lot of supply chains that are built on human misery, right? Like,
That's a very important sentence right there.
yeah,
A lot of supply chains, a lot of what we participate in is built on human misery.
that's really hard. And
And that's the key, isn't it? That's the key. What are we a part of? Where are we complicit?
so the thing I would say about that is it's also important not to get stuck there, because this is like a big system that we're not going to consume our way out of, right? We have to work on the big system change, whether it's supporting the rights of workers or supporting stricter regulation of businesses. And so the work I do is just like one tactic that's part of that, because if we just got caught up in how do we buy the right thing, one, we're still thinking of ourselves as consumers. And I think especially as Jews, like, we are not just what we consume. We're doing holier work than that. I also think it then means that, like, because ethically produced products are often more expensive, it makes ethical consumption a class issue. I don't think that's right either. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers often gets asked, like, why are you working on non-organic tomatoes? Well, like, we shouldn't even be buying half the tomato. I mean, if you knew the there's a book called Tomato Land, which is about the Florida tomato industry. It's about a decade old by now, but like, as I mentioned, there's no soil down there. So like, what goes to produce those tomatoes is not always great. But like, what CW said was, like, first of all, these are the tomatoes Americans eat, right? The Fair Food Program and tomatoes produced under good human rights conditions should not be a luxury. And that's, I think, why we have to look at systems change. And to see ourselves as activists and not just as consumers, because otherwise we'll just get stuck in this place of understanding that the human misery that goes into many of our products, and rather than focusing on, like, it shouldn't be up to us to have to know about every single product that we buy, right? Like, I can tell you some good products to buy, but like, I think we should be activists. I think we should be fighting for the rights of workers. I think we should be pressuring companies to do rights.
That's
Not just
very Jewish. I mean, that's it's all through Torah, right?
It's all through Torah.
Yeah.
I don't think Torah, I mean, I think we are called to do things ethically, but to purchase ethically, but that's not the essence of Torah, right? I think one thing that I'm just learning about this, so I'm going to get this wrong. One thing that I think investors are starting to do is to not just talk to companies about individual issues, but to help educate them on systemic risk, right? So that, like, like, what is not just like, how do they do right on water, but how do they look at climate all through, the risk of climate change in their work, or the risk of this year, there's a lot of shareholder resolutions about racial equity. Also, you can imagine there's a lot of shareholder resolutions this year about COVID. Both, it's interesting, in vaccine access, right? So a lot of our members have filed, like, at Pfizer and J&J, and about access to vaccines, but also the safety of workers. Like, there's a great group in Montclair, New Jersey, based in Montclair, called Investor Advocates for Social Justice. And they filed a resolution on Tyson, which is a poultry producer, about the COVID precautions that their workers did not get. And there were a lot of outbreaks at Tyson plants. And what was interesting is that they got some of the big funds like BlackRock to support their resolution. That I think some of these companies who've said nice
Big
things,
investor funds.
who've said nice things
Mhm.
about human rights, are realizing that maybe they need to back up their nice words with action. And that's also what we're pressuring companies to do too. Like, there's a big industry group called the Business Roundtable that issued, like, a lovely statement last fall, I think, about, like, the rights of people, and about people and planet, but now we actually want them to back it up in their corporate actions. You can always say nice things. It's about what you do.
Did it make a difference for the Tyson plants? Did it make a difference?
It's interesting. I think they're gonna, like, the shareholder resolution passed, so now we have to see what they implement, right? And I think that'll be important, because they have to disclose, the steps that they're taking to protect the workers. I mean, it's often easier to get something that asks for a company to disclose what they're doing to pass. And now we have a resolution that made it through the SEC at Wendy's, about sort of how they're looking at the rights of the workers in their supply chain. Also
That guy was
filed.
just stubborn. He just didn't want to do it. I mean, it wasn't going to hurt him to do a penny a pound more, right?
You know, especially like
Mean.
not a lot of money. You know, I think I remember at one point, this was years ago. So by now the Fair Food Program has given out like tens of millions of dollars in pennies per pound. So I think this was closer when you were with me in Immokalee. And I think at that point, the Fair Food Program had given out like $20 million over the course of, like, I think at that point, 3 or 4 seasons. It's a lot more now because it's more companies and it's more workers and it's more time. But it's like to think about that was $20 million over several years with 14 corporations. Like that wasn't a lot of money. But for the farm workers, it makes such a huge difference in their lives.
Yeah.
So we really have to, and I also think, you know, I don't know, when I look at some of the big corporate profits and I realize that they just could do better by their workers. I think also what's hard is that sometimes corporations that do well by their direct workers, the people who work for them, don't always do as well for all their value chain. And that teaching them that they are responsible there is really important.
Marilyn?
Kind of a reflection, thinking about farm workers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, back in the day when Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez were organizing workers in the field, and their fight was for a union. And we didn't eat grapes, and we didn't eat lettuce, and we went to the grocery stores and all that stuff. And then flock evolved in Ohio over tomatoes and pickles. And they have a different strategy, which is more corporately smart, working through getting coalitions to push for their values. And then the CIW came along with this more worker-based, field-based thing, even though the absolute leadership were not workers. But that's okay. I mean, things are evolving. But I think it shows us that it's going to go step by step. And so you're seeing that with ICRA, with
right?
ICCR. I mean, I think, I guess I'm asking us to be patient and also very impatient.
Yes, it is. Yes, I like that, to be patient and impatient. You know, it's interesting. Most of the leadership of CIW, whether the ones who are farm workers or some of the ones who are allies, are not themselves people of faith, although they come from faith communities. But I like to say that their work was the biggest work of faith because they got 9 corporations. Now there are now 14 corporations that are part of their program, but the first 9 joined before the program was being implemented. So they were escrowing the penny per pound, and they had no idea when the growers would sign on, right? So it took an act of faith to sign all these companies on, hoping that it would pay off at some point. And so they had to be both very impatient because they needed to help farm workers like yesterday, but they also had to be patient to know that change would come. And I think having
to
those
see the paychecks with this comes from McDonald's and this little bit comes from somebody else. And do you know about the Equitable Food Initiative, EFI?
Yeah, that's Oxfam's initiative.
Yeah. So I mean, the issue is on the table. The issue is on the table broadly.
Yeah, I think people are talking about it. It's interesting. New York finally. This is why I think we need multiple approaches. New York State. I live in New Jersey, but TRA is based out of New York, and New York State finally passed the Farm Worker Bill of Rights, which gives, among other things, farm workers in New York the right to organize. And it had been my example for years of how dysfunctional politics were in the state of New York, because I think it took 25 years to pass. For some huge length of time, because it kept getting introduced and it didn't have enough co-sponsors, and it just, so I think that change took a long time, but it also talks to why we need multiple approaches to support the rights of workers, because sometimes getting that legislation, although sometimes the conversation changes overnight, right? If we think about, unfortunately, thanks to COVID, the concept that healthcare is a human right is much more part of the conversation than it was a year ago. I think one thing that we can appreciate when we are patient and impatient at the same time is that even when people have like farther to go than they are, we can see that they've moved. I mean, certainly like the Jewish community has so much work to do on issues of race and issues of policing, but is in a much better, I mean, thanks in part to communities like yours, right? Is doing so much better about it than they were. You know, last spring when George Floyd was murdered, I had shuls who in 2014 would never have hung a Black Lives Matter sign up, calling me and being like, can you come talk to us about race? And what can we do? And so I really wish they had done that before, but I also wanted to like respect the fact that they were doing it now. And I learned a lot from you. I mean, I would say to them, like, what can we do? I was like, get involved locally, call people. Now is the time, you know, just start having these show up. And I think that has made a big difference too.
I just had one quick observation for those congregations. A lot of congregations feel like they need the protection of police because we're potential targets where we're at. We have been targets where we're at, but that's the whole reason they need to also be out on the line for people of color community, because if we're feeling afraid, they're feeling afraid every day. How could we hide behind that fear and not stand up? At the same time, we appreciate the police support for us, but that's the whole point of the movement, is the police have a role and a responsibility, and it's not like if you stand up to them, they're not going to protect you anymore. You know, shame on us to even begin to think that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, again, it's that patience and impatience.
Yeah.
I think from when you were here in 2014, when Mike Brown was murdered, to today, it's not that young Black unarmed precious lives are being, you know, horribly lost to police violence, gun violence, but the outrage, the attention, the people who have been elected to public office slowly are beginning to make a difference.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're seeing in Georgia, to, you know, these companies that are calling the state of Georgia to be responsible, these big corporations. I mean, how much do you think is because they don't want to, you know, they don't want to boycott? How much is consumer based and how much is moral? I mean, are they trying to do, are some of them, can we think that some of them are trying to do the right thing, Rachel?
I don't know. I mean, I think, like, look, what consumer campaigns do, of which boycott is a tactic, is they damage brands and not sales. I think, by the way, that's an important thing to also think about. I mean, I will not sidetrack us talking about BDS, but consumer campaigns damage brands as much as they damage sales, right? And so like for Major League Baseball, for example, they moved the All-Star game because they calculated that it was worse for their brand to be in Georgia than to not be, and so whether they're doing it because it's the right thing, or like, I don't know, for corporations, I think what the right thing is, I think, you know, I think some of them really will, but I
mean, is it moral courage? Are they doing it even if it's bad for them because they know it's the right thing to do, or are they doing it solely because it's good for their brand?
I don't know. I don't know that I think
doesn't
so.
matter.
In some ways it doesn't matter, right? Like, I think that's why also, like, we have to, I know that, like, that if, I think the thing is that they should do it because they should do it, but they don't get brownie points for doing it, right? Like, I think it's interesting. One of the things the Coalition of Immokalee Workers never does is like laud the corporations who signed the Fair Food Program. Like, they should be signing because it's the right thing. So when Trader Joe's signed, the email that we sent out said Mazel Tov Trader Joe's, right? And we learned over the years that that's not, I mean, CIW didn't get mad at us in that case. It just was like, we didn't know. We just were like, thank you, corporation, for doing the right thing. when Walmart signed the Fair Food Program, which came after, there was no campaign against Walmart, and it's the only worker agreement they've ever signed. And I wasn't involved with whatever happened behind the scenes to make that happen. So I don't know why they did it. But the email we sent out did not say Mazel Tov Walmart. It said, congratulations, CIW, right? So I think that, and it was interesting because the email was also really careful to also say, we hope, unfortunately, this hope hasn't been realized. We hope that this will lead Walmart to do other things right by the workers who work for it. And I got a long email from a Trua board member who was like, how could we send out this email? Don't you know that we need to support their workers? I said, did you read my email? And he read it. He's like, oh, well, you did say that. Never mind. So I think we have to, if the corporations do the right thing, the people to congratulate are the organizers who did the organizing to make it so that corporations understand that they can't be complicit in the destruction of our democracy. Because it has to be people like Stacey Abrams who are raising the alarm. They're the ones who we should, and corporations should do the right thing, but it's because of the pressure of activists that they do it.
Thanks, Rachel. Paul, last question.
Yeah, I've got a quick, what about the unions like the United Food Workers? What is their stance? Are they helping? Will they help? Should they help?
In Georgia, I don't know.
Let's say all over. I mean, it's probably one of the largest unions that would really be, I would think, ideal to help.
So that's the union world is a world I'm just starting to learn. I think because I worked primarily with worker centers, it's not something I know as much about, but they are really important as sites of organizing, protecting people, both low-wage workers and higher wage workers. They're really important for voter turnout, right? I think you can see a lot of the anti-union laws that have been passed around the country also as voter suppression laws. I think when someone pointed that out, you ever someone points out something obvious to you and then your eyes are opened. So when someone said to me that union suppression laws were also voter suppression laws, I had not thought about that because of the ways in which they do voter turnout. Right. So I think a lot of them are getting involved, but I don't know as much about how. But there's a number of unions that are members of ICCR, and so I'm hoping to learn a little bit more about how they do some of this work and how they not only organize their workers, but use their investments and their pension funds to support their worker organizing.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking about the unions, Paul. I count on you.
Unions are really important.
Great. So before we let you go, Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you
for sharing your journey with us. And I'm excited about where it's going to go. And I hope you'll call on us.
Absolutely.
And before we let you go, could you give us just what it's such an it's Rosh Chodesh, it's Yom HaZikaron, it's the 17th day of the counting of the Omer. Is there any Torah that is inspiring you right now that you could share with us?
Sure. So I have switched what my Torah that I meditate on is. I was for a long time meditating on every human being in the image of God, but recently I've been thinking a lot about the verse from Micah that what we're called to do is to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That just is my Torah right now. And because I am only coming to understand that that's my Torah right now, I'm still thinking a lot about why, but I think that that's important. That if we can boil down what God wants us to do to humility, justice, and mercy, if we can just do that, we will.
Can I suggest? It's just so remarkable. We've been reading Pirkei Avot every day with the Omer.
Nice.
The Omer is it's the threes. It's the holy threes. Jimmy talks about this. You can unmute Jimmy if you want to add something. But it's it's the balance and then the synthesis. And Micah too. It's also about the threes, right? And to figure out how to love mercy, to seek justice, love mercy, And the synthesis is to walk humbly with God.
Oh, I love that.
It's really it's a great Torah.
Thank you.
Rachel,
Thanks for bringing that to us.
Thank you.
Rudy, you want the last word?
I just have a question. Since chicken is part of Tyson, how did that do when Tyson took food back?
You know, Rudy, I think what I heard Rabbi Rachel say really clearly was we have to, if we focus on workers' rights, right? All the other pieces, and we focus on the human beings,
Mm-hmm.
then everything else will fall into place. And if we listen to them, they'll tell us whether or not to eat chicken.
I'll give.
Because on the TV it said that Tyson is taking chicken back off store shelves. That's what I heard. I'm not trying to
Oh,
make an argument. I'm just
I understand.
Yeah.
because I watch the news, I hear that they take food off clearance. What does that do when you have food stamps and like you don't and you can't get your protein? What's the better food or chicken can you get if you have food stamps then?
I think usually there's a couple of brands of chicken that you can get food stamps with, but you're right. That's a challenge when we limit what people can buy on food stamps can buy. I think that's also an example of where we have to trust people. You know, I definitely think that we should trust people. We should make a lot of options available to people on food stamps.
Okay.
Men, they should be able to go to fresh food,
Yep,
markets, right? As well.
exactly. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Rachel, thank you. I hope you can still go kiss your kids and
They'll be up for a while.
a good journey through the Omer.
Thank you. You too.
And all good things. We can say Mazel Tov to you for your new
Thank you.
job.
Amen. Tova, mazel
Thank you.
tova.
Thank you so
And thank
much.
you for spending time with us.
Thank you.
So,
Great. Have a great evening.
thanks everybody for joining in, and
Well-
hopefully we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Tell Jake hi, Susan.
I will. Thank you, Rudy.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Phil.